I didn't know what it was the first night. I only knew something was wrong with the dark, not outside, inside my room. There's a difference between darkness and absence of light. Most nights you don't think about it. You turn off the switch, the room fades, and your eyes adjust. Shapes settle into place. Familiar things stay familiar. But that night, the dark didn't settle. It felt layered, like something had stepped into it and stayed there. I remember lying still, staring toward the corner near the door, not because I saw something, not yet, just because my attention kept drifting there, like my mind had already noticed something my eyes hadn't caught up to. You ever feel that? That quiet pull? Like your body knows before you do? I told myself it was nothing, just one of those things, stress, fatigue, the kind of thing that makes your thoughts more differently. But the feeling didn't pass, it deepened. The room felt heavier, like the air had thickened, not enough to notice immediately, but enough that breathing felt just slightly off. And then I realized something. I hadn't moved in a while, not because I couldn't, but because I didn't want to, because something in me had decided, without asking, that moving might be a mistake. That's when I saw it, not clearly, not enough to understand it, just a difference in the dark, a vertical shape where there shouldn't have been one, taller than the door frame, too still to be a shadow, too present to be imagination. I blinked, and for a second, it wasn't there. The corner looked normal again, empty, harmless. I almost laughed at myself, almost turned over, convinced my mind had just filled in something that didn't exist. But I didn't turn, because the feeling hadn't left. That same pressure, that same quiet awareness, like something was still there, just no longer where I could easily see it. That's when I understood something I couldn't explain at the time. It hadn't been looking at it. It had been letting me see it. And when it decided that was enough, it stepped back, not away, just out of sight. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it again. That same presence, just beyond where I could confirm it, not moving, not approaching, just existing, waiting. The next morning, everything looked normal. The room, the corner, the door, nothing out of place, nothing that could explain what I had seen or felt. And that should have been the end of it. A bad night, a trick of the mind, something you forget by the time the day gets loud enough to replace it. But it wasn't. Because that night, I made a mistake. I kept thinking about it. And in stories like this, in things tied to something like Nalusa Falaya, that's not harmless, because some things don't need to be summoned. They don't need rituals, they don't need belief, they just need attention. And once you give it to them, they don't forget you, they don't leave, and they don't come from outside. They start appearing closer each time, until you realize something too late. It didn't enter your room, it didn't find your house, it didn't stumble into your life by accident. It noticed you first, and now it was waiting for you to notice it again. I told myself it was over. That's what you do after a night like that. You wake up, let the daylight erase it, and convince yourself your mind just went somewhere it shouldn't have. And for a while, it worked. The room looked normal, the corners held nothing but shadow the way they were supposed to. I even stood in the same spot near the door, just to prove it to myself. Same walls, same angles, same emptiness. Nothing there. But the feeling didn't match what I was seeing. It followed me through the day in small ways, nothing obvious, just delays, moments where I'd lose track of what I was doing, words slipping out of reach mid-sentence, a heaviness that didn't belong to anything physical. like something had taken just enough from me to be noticed, but not enough to be explained. I ignored it. You have to, because the moment you start trying to make sense of something like that, you give it space to grow. So I stayed busy, filled the day with noise, movement, distraction, and for a few hours, it felt like I had outrun it until evening came. There's a point in every day where the light changes. Now, not sunset exactly, just before it. When everything softens and shadows start to stretch in ways you don't usually pay attention to. That's when I felt it again. Not stronger, closer. I was standing in the hallway, halfway between rooms, when it hit me. That same stillness from the night before, not around me, inside the space, like the air itself had paused. I didn't look immediately. I should have, but something in me resisted the idea, like turning my head would confirm something I wasn't ready to accept. So I stood there, listening, waiting, and then something shifted. Not a sound, not movement I could track, just a change in the way the darkness sat in the corner of the room ahead. That same corner, the one near the door. I felt it before I saw it, that pressure, that awareness, like the room had become aware of me being in it. Slowly, carefully, I looked, and there it was, not fully, not clearly, but enough. A vertical stretch of darkness that didn't match the shape of the wall behind it, too tall, too narrow, and this time, it didn't disappear when I focused on it. It stayed, still, unmoving, like it had learned something from the night before, like it understood that I needed more time to see it properly. My chest tightened, not panic, not yet. Something quieter, something worse, recognition, because I knew this wasn't new. This wasn't something that had just appeared again. This was something that had never left. It had just stepped back, out of sight, out of certainty, and now it was stepping forward again. Not fast, not aggressively, just enough to be noticed, just enough to remind me I hadn't imagined anything. I took a step back, and for a second, I thought it moved, not in a way I could prove, but in the way the darkness adjusted, slightly, as if it had matched my distance without crossing the space between us. I didn't stay. I turned, walked away, faster than I wanted to admit, and didn't look back until I reached another room with more light, more space, more distance. But even there, the feeling stayed. That quiet weight, that sense that something had shifted, not in the room I left, but in the way I existed inside it. Because now I knew something I couldn't ignore anymore. It wasn't confined to one place. It didn't belong to that corner, and it wasn't waiting for night to return. Whatever I had seen, whatever had stepped into the dark and let me notice it, wasn't attached to the room. It was attached to me. And things like that, things tied to something like Nalusa Falaya, don't leave when you turn the lights on. They just wait for the next movement, for the next moment you're alone enough to see them again. After the second night, I stopped telling myself it was nothing. You can only deny something for so long before the denial starts to feel louder than the thing itself. And this, whatever it was quiet, too quiet. That's what made it worse. It didn't chase me, didn't make noise, didn't force itself into view. It just stayed near the edge of things, where you don't look directly, where your eyes pass over without stopping. That's where it lived. I started noticing it during the day, not fully, not clearly, just in fragments. A stretch of darkness that felt too tall in a doorway until I blinked and it wasn't there. A shadow behind a piece of furniture that didn't match the angle of the light until I looked twice and it corrected itself. reflections that seemed slightly delayed, like something had been standing behind me a second too long. Nothing I could prove, nothing I could hold on to, but it was enough to change how I moved. I stopped turning my back to open spaces, stopped standing in rooms with the lights off behind me, stopped letting silence sit too long without breaking it, because silence, that's where it felt strongest. That's where it felt closest. Nights got worse, not in the way you would expect. It didn't suddenly appear right in front of me. It didn't become clearer. It became more patient. I'd lie in bed, staring into the same corners, waiting for that shape to form again. Sometimes it didn't, and those nights were almost worse because the absence didn't feel like safety. It felt like choice, like it had decided not to show itself, like it didn't need to. That's when I started noticing something else. I wasn't just appearing, it was positioning itself. Always just out of direct focus, always where my eyes would land lost, never where I expected it. It was learning, or maybe it had always known. One night I tested it. I stayed completely still, didn't shift, didn't adjust, didn't scan the room the way I usually did. I picked one spot on the wall and kept my eyes locked there. Minutes passed, maybe more. Time feels different when you're waiting for something you don't want to see. And then I felt it. Not movement, presence, closer than before, not across the room, behind me. I didn't turn. I couldn't. Every instinct told me to, but something stronger held me still. Because I understood something in that moment. If I turned too quickly, I won't see it. It would step back again, disappear just enough to stay uncertain. So I moved slowly, carefully, just enough to shift my vision and catch the edge of where it stood. And there it was, not fully, not completely, but closer than it had ever been. A vertical stretch of darkness rising higher than anything in the room, too thin, too still. The edges not quite blending with the shadows around it, like it didn't belong to them. It didn't move, didn't react, but it didn't disappear either. It stayed long enough for me to understand something I hadn't before. This wasn't random, this wasn't accidental. It wasn't appearing wherever it wanted. It was appearing where I would eventually look. Not where I was looking, where I would look next. Like it knew the path my attention would take before I did. That's when the fear changed. It stopped being about what I was seeing and became about what it knew. Because something like that, something that doesn't need to rush, doesn't need to hide completely, doesn't need to prove itself, isn't trying to scare you. Not yet. It's doing something else, something slower, something more deliberate. It's letting you adjust, letting you get used to it, letting the idea of its presence settle into something that feels almost normal. Because once that happens, once you stop reacting the way you should, that's where it gets closer, and things tied to something like Nalusa Falaya don't rush their approach. They wait until you stop questioning them, until you start expecting them, until the space between you and them no longer feels like distance at all. By the fourth night, I stopped trying to prove it was there because something worse had started happening. I didn't need to see it anymore. I could feel what it was doing. It wasn't getting closer the way I expected. It wasn't stepping out of the dark or reaching toward me or forcing some kind of confrontation. It was taking something, slowly, quietly, in ways I couldn't measure but couldn't ignore. It started with energy. Simple things became harder than they should have been. Getting up felt heavier, thinking felt slower, even speaking started to feel like effort, like words had to be pulled through something thick before they came out. I told myself I was just tired. That made sense. until the tiredness didn't go away, until rest didn't fix it. Sleep didn't help either, because sleep wasn't normal anymore. I drift off just enough to lose awareness and then snap awake again, not from a sound, not from movement, from a feeling, like something had just leaned closer, like something had been watching me and I had almost seen it. Every time I woke up, the room felt wrong, not different, just occupied, and the dark, it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt filled, not with movement, with presence. That same vertical stretch of shadow began appearing more often now, not fully, not clearly, but enough that I stopped questioning whether it was real, because it wasn't just appearing in one place anymore. It was adjusting. One night near the door, another near the window, once at the far edge of the bed, always just out of reach, always just far enough to keep me from reacting, but close enough to remind me it could move wherever it wanted. And the closer it appeared, the worse I felt. Not fear, not exactly. Something heavier, something that settled deeper than that. A kind of quiet emptiness, like something inside me was being drained, not violently, not all at once, but gradually, in small pieces I wouldn't notice disappearing until they were already gone. Motivation, clarity, even small things, interest, focus, the ability to care about what I was doing began to slip. And that's when I realized something I should have understood earlier. This wasn't about being seen, it wasn't about being watched, it was about being weakened, prepared. Whatever this was, whatever had attached itself to me, wasn't trying to scare me into running. It was doing the opposite. It was making sure I couldn't, because when the fear fades, when energy drains, when the mind stops pushing back, resistance disappears. And without resistance, something like this doesn't need to force its way in. It just settles deeper. I started noticing how still it was, even when I caught glimpses of it, those stretched, unnatural edges barely separating from the darkness. It never moved the way something physical would. No shifting, no adjusting, no signs of effort. It didn't behave like something that existed in the same space as me. It behaved like something that had merged with it. Like the shadows themselves were no longer just absence of light, but something that belonged to it. And the more I thought about it, the worse I felt, because that meant something I didn't want to accept, something I tried to push away every time it surfaced. It wasn't just appearing in my room, it wasn't just following me, it was affecting me, changing something internal, and the more it took, the easier it became for it to stay. That's when the night stopped being the worst part. Daylight didn't fix it anymore. The heaviness stayed, the silence followed, and even in full light, I started catching those same unnatural fragments at the edge of my vision, shorter, fainter, but still there, still positioned just outside direct focus, still waiting, because something like Nalusa Falaya doesn't need darkness to exist. Darkness just makes it easier for you to notice. What it really needs is time, and the longer it stays with you, the more it takes, until eventually there's less of you left to push it away. There's a point where fear changes. At first, it's sharp, immediate. Your body reacts before your mind can process what's happening. You feel it, you resist it, you try to push it away, but that doesn't last. Not when something stays, not when something takes its time. After a while, fear dulls, and when it dulls, something else takes its place. Acceptance. Not the kind you choose, the kind that happens when you're too tired to keep pushing back. That's where I was by the fifth night. I wasn't trying to prove it was real anymore. I wasn't trying to explain it. I wasn't even trying to avoid it. I just existed around it. And that was the mistake, because the moment I stopped resisting, it got closer. I didn't notice it immediately, not in a dramatic way. There was no sudden appearance, no clear moment where it stepped out into full view. It was subtler than that, more controlled. I was sitting in the room, lights dim but not off, just enough shadow for things to blur slightly at the edges. The kind of lightning where your eyes don't fully commit to what they're seeing. That's when I felt it again, not across the room, not in the corner, closer, much closer, right behind me. The difference this time, I didn't freeze, I didn't panic, I just knew, like my body had already adjusted to the idea that it would be there eventually. That's how far it had gotten. I didn't turn right away, not out of fear, out of certainty, because I understood something now. It wasn't going to disappear if I looked. That phase was over, so I turned slowly, and for the first time, I saw enough. Not fully, not completely, but enough to understand what it was. A shape that didn't belong to light or shadow, too tall, too thin. Its edges stretched unnaturally, like darkness pulled into a form it wasn't meant to hold. The head, if it could be called that, didn't have features, no eyes, no face, but it still felt like it was looking at me, not from a distance, from right there, close enough that the space between us didn't feel like space anymore. And the worst part, it didn't move. It didn't need to. Because I understood something in that moment that made everything else irrelevant. It had already adjusted to me, my reactions, my patterns, my limits, and now that I wasn't resisting, there was nothing stopping it from closing that distance. I leaned forward slightly, just to test it, just to see if it would react, and for a second, the darkness around it shifted, not outward, not away, inward, like it had matched my movement without actually moving. That's when the realization hit. It wasn't approaching in steps. It wasn't crossing space the way something physical would. It was aligning itself with me. The less I resisted, the more it fit into my space, into my awareness, into something deeper than either of those. And once that alignment begins, distance stops meaning anything. That's when I felt it. Not physically, not like a touch, something else. A pressure from the inside, like something was pressing against my thoughts instead of my body. Testing, pushing, not forcing its way in, just seeing how much space there was. And there was more space now than before because I had stopped fighting. That's the part no one tells you. You think resistance is about strength, about fear, about holding yourself together, but with something like this, resistance is the only thing that keeps it separate from you. And once that's gone, it doesn't need to chase you anymore. It doesn't need to hide. It doesn't need to wait in corners or behind doors, because now it's already where it wanted to be, close enough to not be seen clearly, but close enough to be felt constantly. And things tied to something like Nalusa Falaya don't rush the final step. They let you adjust the closeness first. They let you get used to the idea that it's always there, because once that becomes normal, there's nothing left to stop what comes next. After that night, the distance stopped mattering, not because it moved closer, because it didn't need to. I started noticing something I couldn't ignore anymore. It wasn't just around me, it was affecting what I thought. At first, it was small, subtle, a thought that didn't feel like it belonged to me, but didn't feel foreign enough to question immediately. A hesitation where there shouldn't have been one, a sudden drop in focus, a sentence in my mind, in my head, that ended differently than I intended. I brushed it off. You have to. Because the moment you start questioning your own thoughts, things begin to break down faster than you can control. But it kept happening more often, more clearly. I'd be doing something simple, reading, writing, even just sitting, and suddenly my mind would go quiet, not calm, empty, like something had just passed through it and taken something with it on the way out. And in that emptiness, there was space. That's when I started understanding what it was really doing. It wasn't just draining me, it was making room for itself. Sleep got worse, not because of nightmares, because of awareness. I'd fall asleep, and instead of losing consciousness, it felt like I was hovering just above it, aware enough to notice something shifting beneath the surface of my thoughts, like something was moving through them, not aggressively, but with purpose, rearranging, testing, learning how much control it could take without being noticed. One night, I didn't wake up immediately. I stayed in that half state between sleep and awareness long enough to feel it clearly, not around me, not behind me, inside the space where my thoughts should have been, a presence, not speaking, not forming words, but existing there as if it had always access to that space. And the worst part, it didn't feel invasive. It felt natural, like something that had been there longer than I had realized. That's when I forced myself awake, sat up, breathing harder than I should have been. The room was dark, silent, and for a moment, I thought maybe it had crossed some kind of boundary. Maybe this was the point where things would escalate, where it would show itself fully, force a confrontation, reveal what it actually was. But it didn't. The room looked the same, the shadows stayed still, nothing moved, and yet I could still feel it. Not in the room, in my head, faint, distant, but present, like a second layer beneath my own thoughts. That's when the fear changed again, because up until that point, there was still a line, a separation. It was outside, I was inside. Even when it got close, even when it stood behind me, even when it aligned itself with my movements, there was still a difference. Now, there wasn't. That line had thinned, not completely gone, but weak enough to cross, and something like Nalusa Falaya doesn't rush that moment. It doesn't force its way in. It waits until the space is ready, until the resistance is gone, until the mind itself stops rejecting what doesn't belong. Because once that happens, entry isn't an event, it's a process, one that's already begun before you realize it. And by the time you do, it's no longer a question of whether something is there, it's a question of how much of you is still yours. I tried to push back after that, tried to focus harder, stay alert, keep control over my thoughts, but it didn't matter because resistance now felt different, weaker, like trying to hold something in place that was already slipping through your fingers. And the more I tried, the more I realized something I didn't want to accept. It wasn't just learning about me anymore, it was learning how to be me. And once something reaches that point, once it understands your thoughts well enough to move through them without resistance, it doesn't need to stay in the shadows because the shadows are no longer the only place it exists. It didn't speak at first. That's what I kept telling myself, because as long as it wasn't speaking, as long as there were no words, no clear communication, there was still something I could hold on to. Silence meant distance. Silence meant it hadn't crossed that final line. But silence doesn't stay silent forever. Not when something has already learned how you think. It started the same way everything else had, subtle, almost easy to ignore, a thought forming in my head that felt slightly off, not wrong enough to reject, just unfamiliar enough to notice if I paid attention. At first, it was just fragments, short phases that didn't connect to anything I was doing. A word here, a sentence there, nothing threatening, nothing clear. But they weren't mine. I knew that. The structure was wrong. The timing was wrong. They didn't follow the way my thoughts usually moved. They just appeared, then disappeared. Like something testing whether I would react. I didn't. I tried not to, because reacting would mean acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would mean giving it more space. But ignoring it didn't stop it. It adjusted. The next time, it didn't just appear, it blended. The thought came in the middle of something else, something I was already thinking, slipping into the flow of so smoothly that I almost didn't catch it. Almost. That's when I realized what I was doing. It wasn't trying to interrupt, it was trying to be indistinguishable. And once it reached that point, there was no clean way to separate what was mine from what wasn't. That's when the voice changed, not louder, clearer, more structured. Not external, not something I could hear with my ears, but something that formed with intention, like a thought that had direction behind it. The first time it stayed long enough to understand, I froze, because it wasn't random, it wasn't fragmented, it wasn't testing anymore. It was speaking, not out loud, inside. And the voice, it sounded like mine. Same tone, same rhythm, same way of forming sentences. If I hadn't known what had been happening before, I wouldn't have questioned it at all. That's what made it worse, because now there was no barrier, no difference in sound, no external presence to push away, just thoughts that weren't entirely mine anymore. It didn't say anything dramatic, no threats, no warnings, nothing that would make it obvious. That's not how something like this works. It said simple things, things that could pass as normal, small shifts in how I interpreted things, suggestions, reactions, emotions that felt slightly stronger than they should have been, and each time it happened, it stayed a little longer. That's when I made the mistake. I responded, not out loud, not consciously, just a reaction in my own mind, a disagreement, a pushback, something small, but it was enough, because the moment I responded, it changed. Not immediately, not in a way that felt aggressive, but the next time it appeared, it answered back. That's when the fear became something else entirely, because now it wasn't just present, it wasn't just observing, it wasn't just learning, it was interacting, and it was doing it through the only channel left, the one place I thought still belonged completely to me, my own voice. That's when I understood something I should have realized earlier, something that made everything else fall into one place. It never needed its own form, it never needed its own sound, because once it understood mine, it could use it. And something tied to Nalusa Falaya doesn't announce itself, it doesn't reveal itself clearly, it becomes something else, something familiar, something trusted, something you don't question immediately. Because once you stop questioning the voice, once you stop separating it from your own, there's nothing left to protect. No boundary, no distinction, just a single stream of thought where not everything in it belongs to you anymore. There's a point where stories usually end, a final encounter, a decisive moment, a clean separation between what was happening and what comes after. But this didn't behave like a story anymore. It behaved like something ongoing, something that doesn't respect endings. By the time I understood that, I had already stopped looking for it the way I used to. Not because it felt safe, because safe wasn't a category that applied anymore. There were no more clear sightings, no more defined moments where I could say, there it is. Just continuity. A presence that didn't need form to remain consistent. It showed up in how silence felt slightly structured, in how rooms felt subtly less empty than they should, and how my thoughts no longer felt entirely spontaneous, not controlled, not taken, just influenced, like a hand that doesn't push you but gently adjusts your direction so often you stop noticing the difference. I stopped reacting to it outwardly. That was the strange part. Life continued, people talked to me, days passed normally from the outside. Nothing dramatic happened, but inside that normality, something else was running in parallel. A second layer, always present, always aligned just slightly ahead of me. And that's when I understood the final shift. It wasn't trying to appear anymore. It wasn't trying to reveal itself. It had already done everything it needed to do. Because the goal was never to stay visible. The goal was to become unnecessary to see. At some point, I tried to remember when I last saw it clearly, the tall shape, the unnatural form, that moment when it stood fully in front of me, but the memory felt distant, not gone, just no longer anchored the same way, like it belonged to a version of me that still believed separation existed. And that's when it hit me. Nothing new was happening anymore. No escalation. Not escalation requires contrast. This was consistency, a settled state, something that had reached equilibrium and stopped needing change. That's what permanence feels like. Not fear, not presence, just inevitability. And somewhere in that realization, I stopped being able to point to where it ended and where I began. Not because it fully replaced me, but because the distinction stopped producing any meaningful difference in how things moved forward. Choices still happened, thoughts still formed, life still continued, but everything had a slight adjustment to it, a bias I couldn't fully isolate. That's when I understood what something like Nalusa Falaya actually represents in the deepest version of the story. Not a creator that arrives, not a being that leaves, but a condition that remains once awareness of it has been established long enough for resistance to dissolve into familiarity. And once that familiarity takes hold, there's no final confrontation left, no moment of resolution, no clear ending, only continuation with something that no longer needs to announce itself, because it has already finished becoming part of the space where your attention begins.